We'll take more of your calls on Cuba. We'll hear from Otto Reich with the Brock Group, and our second guest, former Senator George McGovern, will talk about his recent meeting with Cuba's President Fidel Castro. The two discussed refugee and economic policy.
George McGovern, former senator, 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, now the president of the Middle East Policy Council. You just returned from Cuba and a meeting with Fidel Castro. What did he have to say about the U.S.?
Well, he's more interested right now in getting the economic restrictions on Cuba lifted than anything else. He thinks that he made a real concession in stopping the flow of refugees into Florida, which we very much wanted him to do. I think it's fair to say it has stopped, but obviously he expects us to take some future steps. I think the first thing he wants to see is for President Clinton to reverse the new restrictions that he added on August 20th, restrictions on travel to Cuba, restrictions on Cubans sending money to their families in Cuba, restrictions on scholars and others that might want to have some relationship to Cuba. And beyond that, he's hopeful that at long last he can get into discussions looking towards a lifting of the American embargo.
Reading from the Associated Press today, Fidel Castro reportedly made an immigration deal with the U.S. to avoid embarrassing President Clinton, is the way this is written, and this is quoting yourself.
Well, that's true. This is exactly what he said, that he had made a strong public statement that he would not negotiate on ending the refugee flow unless we at the same time entered into discussions on lifting the embargo. He reversed that position. When I asked him why, he said that he came to the conclusion that the political situation in the United States right now would not permit President Clinton to lift the embargo, and that he didn't want to embarrass him by continuing the refugee flow, even though he had to at least temporarily give up his hopes for discussions on the embargo. That doesn't mean this was an entirely humanitarian move on his part. I think what he was saying is that he doesn't want to break any relationship he might have in the, either now or in the future, with the Clinton administration by painfully embarrassing them at the present time.
Otto Reich is a partner with the Brock Group, who also leads the US-Cuba Business Council. Thanks for joining us tonight. Your thoughts on the embargo?
I think the embargo, the reasons why the embargo was established in the first place have not changed. I think that, of course, Fidel Castro wants to get it lifted because he wants the United States to take over the role that the Soviet Union had of subsidizing his dictatorship. It's a 35-year dictatorship. We have absolutely no reason to change our policy as long as he doesn't change the internal conditions on the island and is continuing to imprison 11 million people.
Let me just say that lifting the embargo doesn't call for any subsidy on our part. It calls for the normalization of trade relations. He's not asking for American charity. He's asking that he be treated as we treat other communist countries. Some years ago, we had the same view that has just been expressed here towards China, that we're not going to deal with them, we're not going to recognize them, we're not going to trade with them until they embrace democracy. President Nixon held that view for a long time until he changed his mind in 1972, went to China, opened up relations, and I think it's fair to say that our trade, our travel, our discussions with them have had something to do with moving Cuba in a little more, or moving China in a little more moderate direction. I'd like to see the same process begin with Castro.
Well, first, Castro can trade with anybody in the world except the United States. This is not a blockade. This is a unilateral embargo on the part of the United States. So if he had money, he could buy anything he wanted. If he had $10 billion today, he could buy $10 billion worth of goods. The reason he wants the U.S. embargo lifted is because he wants credits. The other countries with whom he is trading won't give him credits, for one thing, because he doesn't pay back, unless they figure that exports from the island will enter the largest market in the world. That's our market. And that is our leverage to get the internal conditions in Cuba changed. That's the reason why the embargo was established. The embargo, by the way, came years after Castro himself cut off imports from the United States. I mean, we have to have a certain historical perspective. I was born in Cuba, so I lived through the entire revolution. And I'm sorry, Senator, your facts are wrong. And
do you think your policy is working, that you're improving things in Cuba, that Castro's behaving better because of
the policy is to change the government of Cuba to a democratic one. If we lift the embargo, all it will do is it will lengthen the suffering of the people of Cuba under Castro.
We've tried for 35 years your approach. How much longer before?
We haven't tried. First of all, it hasn't been my approach. It's been the approach of 9 consecutive United States presidents. Second, the embargo has not begun to hurt Castro until presently. This is now his #1 foreign policy priority. This is why he invites people such as yourself, and he tells them things which are not true. I'm sorry, I saw your interview on Larry King the other night. Your facts are not correct on many of the aspects.
Where am I wrong? I think if you're going to suggest that wrong, what facts are wrong?
The history of the embargo. The embargo was established, for example, because he confiscated American properties without compensation. He hasn't paid for those properties.
I understand that.
And he's not offering to pay for those properties.
Listen, I've talked with him on several occasions the last 20 years. I bring up the American claims every time. I've never once had him say that's not subject to negotiation. He always says that can go on the table with other
You know
issues.
what he says? He says that we owe him $40 billion because of the...
Let's start negotiating these things instead of talking at each other long distance and calling names back and forth. I don't think that Fidel Castro represents a fundamentally different type of communism than we had in China or in the Soviet Union. Yet in those areas, we found it in our interest way back in 1933 to recognize the Soviet Union. They had monstrous leadership there, but gradually, with the course of time, the fact that they had discourse with us, trade with us, Americans going there, I think it had some impact.
Well, I disagree. First of all, that is not what brought the Soviet Union down. We did not have the kind of trade that you're proposing with Cuba, with the Soviet Union.
I'm not talking...
Second, after 22 years of dealing with China, there's still no democracy in China.
I'm not
There is a free market economy developing alongside a totalitarian dictatorship in China. I know you're not supporting a totalitarian dictatorship.
I just want to cut in for a sec because I want to tell the viewers that we're going to invite them to call in just a couple minutes. We will have plenty of time for further discussion later. Good evening again from Washington, D.C. Our topic for the next 30-35 minutes will be U.S. policy toward Cuba, specifically with regards to the economic embargo that's been in place for several decades now. We have 2 guests with us. We're happy to be joined by George McGovern, a former senator from South Dakota, who is the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, who now runs an organization known as the Middle East Policy Council. We are also joined by Otto Reich, who is a partner with the Brock Group, who also leads the US-Cuba Business Council. We're going to go to the calls in just a couple of minutes. Mr. Reich, tell us first a little bit about the Business Council and what it's all about.
It's a group of American companies that would like to do business in a free market, democratic Cuba. And they're simply preparing, doing studies, and have established a trade association and have said that they would be willing to do business. Many of them did business before in Cuba, do business with a free market and democratic Cuba, which is the only way that Cuba will come out of the extreme poverty in which 35 years of communist dictatorship have put it.
What kind of companies are we talking about?
Large, mostly Fortune 500 companies.
Senator McGovern, you'll actually brief President Clinton tomorrow, I read?
I'm going to go to the White House tomorrow. I don't know whether I'll see the president, but I'm talking with his aides. There's one point I wanted to make here. I think this is a legitimate question. A year ago, when I talked to President Castro, he said, "I'd like to put a question to you. Why do you send 27,000 American soldiers to feed starving people in Somalia and then deliberately attempt to starve Cubans? Is that because I am worse than the leaders of Somalia, the warlords of Somalia?" And then before I could answer that, he said, "Why do you grant most favored nation trading status to the Chinese, which you've done for years, and deny any kind of trade with us?" I think those are legitimate questions that a great many Americans think we haven't answered very well.
I really hope that you don't believe that we are starving the Cuban people. It is Fidel Castro who established the economic policies 35 years ago that have resulted in the bank. Just a minute. Let me answer your question, because you said it was a legitimate question. I'm going to give you what I hope is a legitimate answer. It is Castro's policies that have starved the Cuban people. The United States did not establish Marxist economics in Cuba, did not establish a system of of prison camps. We haven't mentioned human rights. Yes, he is worse than the Somalian warlords, much less, because they don't have psychological torture in the jails as he does. They have not been condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Commission, as Castro has year after year, in the same level of condemnation as Afghanistan under the Soviet puppet regime of Najibullah, as Romania under Ceausescu, as Iraq under Saddam Hussein. That is the kind of person that you're dealing with. How can you believe anything the man says?
Let me just put it to you this way. What if I were to concede all of the things you say?
Well, they happen to be true. I have the UN Human Rights Commission report.
For the purposes of discussion here tonight, let's concede all those things. Isn't that an indication that your policy is failing?
No, it's an indication that Castro is failing.
Well, but you're not moving him in the direction of a more moderate figure.
A member of your own party, Congressman Torricelli of New Jersey, has introduced legislation called the Cuban Democracy Act, which has only in the last 18 months begun to have an effect, which is why Castro has made the lifting of the embargo the #1 priority. Now, just a minute. I'll tell you something. It's not the embargo we should be talking about. We should be talking about democracy in Cuba. The embargo is a tool with which to try to bring about a democratic government in Cuba. Why doesn't Castro talk about that? Nobody's starving his people except himself. They're fleeing him, and he didn't. He didn't agree to this.
I didn't come here to defend the behavior of Fidel Castro.
I'm sorry, you are. You did on Larry King the other night.
I haven't defended his behavior at all. What I'm trying to say.
You said that the United States is starving his people, Senator.
Well, that's what he said. I didn't say that.
Well, but I mean, you implied that he was correct. You said it was a legitimate question. It is not a legitimate question.
Let me put it to you this way. I said to him, I believe there are 3 reasons why the Cuban economy is in trouble. One, the system itself that you've installed here has not worked very well. Secondly, the cutoff of Soviet aid a few years ago has been a disaster as far as Cuba is concerned. I think you'd agree with that. And third, the American embargo has kept you from being able to purchase commodities from us in an area where the shipping costs are less. But beyond that, he said, let me tell you something that a lot of Americans aren't aware of. You have your whole global diplomatic corps trying to block credits to Cuba, trying to discourage foreigners from investing here. Now, if we want to make a capitalist out of Castro, why don't we accept his invitations for joint American venture capital to go there and to develop business? You're waiting for a totally free market. Mr. Reich, you may not get a totally free market.
We'll get an answer in just a little bit. I want to get the callers in because that's the reason why we're here in the first place. Gaithersburg, Maryland, you're our first call. Thanks for hanging on. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Good evening to your guest. Good evening, Mr. McGovern.
Good evening.
I feel like I know you. I've been defending you for so many years. I don't want to get in the middle of this argument that you're having here. I do think, though, that we are going to be moving towards some sort of reconciliation with Castro. I mean, you hear the conservatives talking about it now, but I would say that it would be more effective if it came from a conservative. But I wanted to ask your guest, either one of you, to what degree do you think that Castro thought that Clinton was vulnerable because of the Cuban riot incident in Arkansas? I mean, I had a feeling that he probably looked at this and thought that he could intimidate Bill Clinton, and I have to say the president handled himself well, and this is probably why he took such a tough stance.
Okay, let's get a response to that. Who wants to?
I think Castro underestimated Clinton. I think he thought Clinton was going to react the way, frankly, that President Carter reacted, with weakness. Castro is a totalitarian dictator. He executes anybody who disagrees with him, and he acts like a bully. Clinton stood up to him, not only did not allow him to expel these people, to let these people leave Cuba, but he cut off as the senator mentioned, the remittances and the travel to Cuba. So he hurt Castro where it really hurts him, which is in the pocketbook. So I think he did underestimate President Clinton in this respect.
Let me respond to another part of the question here. The gentleman said that he thought it might be helpful if we could find a good accepted conservative to take the position I'm taking. If you pick up the last book written by Richard Nixon, I think we'd agree he was a conservative, you will find in that book that was published a few days after his death a section on Cuba. He said, our policy of 35 years has been a failure. The time has come to try something different. What I recommend is the course that we've pursued towards China. We should lift the embargo on Cuba. We should begin discussions with them. We should open up the same kind of forces that were helpful in China. Well, let me, I'm just answering the gentleman's question for a conservative.
Well, I mean, if you look at Tiananmen Square, that's not exactly being helpful.
If Mr. Nixon were here tonight, we could have a Nixon-McGovern consensus on Cuba. That's all I'm saying. It is, I think my position's a very conservative one, which is to let American trade, American capital, American investment go to work in Cuba, and I believe you'll see some changes there that we can applaud.
Let's go ahead and get another call in. Newport News, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, the question I have is, if you state that the policy for 35 years has failed. The reason why it has failed because of the subsidies by the Soviet Union. When this continues for another 2 or 3 years, Castro will be gone. You won't have nothing to worry about. And we won't have to worry about sending any troops or anything in like we're going to do to Haiti.
Senator, what are conditions like in Cuba?
It's very bad. There's no question the economic distress is real. What the gentleman says is true about the conditions there. They've gotten much worse since the Soviet Union disappeared from the scene. But what has not changed, as near as I can tell, and I believe American intelligence forces agree with this, Castro's still in complete charge of that army. He's in complete charge of the secret intelligence forces. Even if we were able to produce some kind of a political explosion where tens of thousands of Cubans rose up against Castro, what are they going to do? Stand and die in front of Castro's army? The bloodshed is mind-boggling. How much better it would be if we used the method that I'm pleading for here tonight, which is the one that I think worked quite well with other communist countries, and that's pulling them into the Western orbit, pulling them into exposure to our ways of doing things. And I think that could work in Cuba. Maybe not. Maybe my hopes are wrong. But what I'm really trying to plead for here tonight is an effort to let the American way be shown in Cuba instead of isolating those people.
First of all, by that logic, you're saying that because Castro has been able to maintain totalitarian control, we should side with him because the Cuban people have no chance of overthrowing him. That's one thing. That's one interpretation of what you said. I thought the United States always stood for the underdog and for human rights. As I've told you what the human rights record is. It is worse than, in fact, it is worse than the record of the Soviet Union in the last 30 years since Stalin. Is as bad as Stalin's.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, the United Nations, even the United Nations Human Rights Commission, by the way, disagrees with you. But let me say one thing about American companies. For example, did you know, or investment, you say investment will open up Cuba. The International Labor Organization has condemned Cuba for the use of forced labor. Any investor going into Cuba today cannot contract directly with a worker. He has to pay the state in hard currency. The state turns around and pays the worker at the local, at the 1-to-1 ratio, which is artificial. The state earns 99 cents out of every dollar that a foreign investor pays to Castro. That's one reason why there's so little foreign investment. There's practically no foreign investment because no businessman in his right mind is going to deal with somebody who is as unstable as Fidel Castro.
We need to go ahead and get another call in. Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Reich. Mr. Reich, I was wondering why it is that every time we see a Cuban American, they are white, when in fact if you go there you find that the majority of the population is black. I've also noticed that the majority of Cuban Americans want Cuba to be the way it was before the last revolution there. In fact, most of the Cuban Americans were plantation owners, and blacks were essentially slaves who worked on those plantations. And I'm curious why it is that every time we see a Cuban American, they're white.
Okay, Mr. Reich?
About 40% of the Cuban population is white, about 30% mulatto or mixture, and about 30% black. So in other words, 60% is non-white. you know, the other questions are so ridiculous that I'm not sure they really deserve an answer, that most Cuban Americans were plantation owners. I don't know any plantation owners, and I know quite a few Cuban Americans. As you can see in the faces of the raft people, the people who are leaving Cuba, there are quite a few black faces. This is not a racial issue. This is a political issue. The people who are fleeing Cuba are fleeing because of political and economic reasons. They're not yelling. The people who rioted against Castro on the 5th of August, and by the way, his hold his grip on Cuba is loosening. He's not maintaining control like he used to. The people are yelling libertad, libertad, meaning freedom. They're not yelling bread. They're not saying we want investments. They say we want Castro out. That's what they were saying.
I can only say, Mr. Reich, that if you look at the statistics, the increase in the flow of refugees from Cuba has kept pace with the deepening economic distress. I'm sure you're right that there's some people in Cuba that are unhappy about the suppression of liberty. Why wouldn't they be unhappy?
Some people?
But yes, I concede that. But you're suggesting here, I think, that somehow Fidel Castro came to power and destroyed some kind of haven of freedom in Cuba. The Batista regime that controlled that country for 25 years set the stage for the rise of Castro.
I lived under that regime, and I don't think you did. I opposed Batista. I saw my friends, 14-year-old students, get killed, so you don't have to lecture me on Batista.
Right.
Nobody I know wants... First of all, Batista is dead, so I doubt he's coming back to Cuba. That is a false argument that people, when they start losing the argument of defending Castro, they always bring back the ghost of Batista.
I've never defended Castro.
You say, I'm sorry, you have defended Castro. You've defended his arguments. You've repeated his arguments. You said that it's the American people and the American government that is starving his people. It is Fidel Castro who's starving the people of Cuba.
Well, we don't need to go over that again.
No.
We have a couple faxes here. Let's go to one. This question asks, either of you, this is from California, which is a smarter policy to follow, absorbing the refugees and the costs involved until Castro topples, or spending the money and invading Cuba to overthrow him?
I don't think there's any support for invading Cuba again. We tried that in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. It was an utter disaster. I doubt if you could find one American in 10,000 that's in favor of going to war against Cuba, and there's no point in it. Here's a man who's willing to sit down and negotiate with us on any point we want to raise. Why are we so afraid of that? Is he 10 foot tall, that our diplomats can't go and talk to him about human rights, talk to him about democracy, talk to him about trade, talk to him about political prisoners? Why don't we put...
Senator, we have an intersection in Havana. They have an intersection in Washington. We just concluded a 13th round in the last 10 years of talks about migration. We do talk to Castro. He knows exactly what he has to do to get the embargo lifted and U.S. policy changed. Well, President Bush, President Clinton, they've all restated the policy recently, and I can go back through the last 9 presidents.
Well, Mr. Reich, you imply that when I try to make a case that it's in the interest of the United States to treat Castro as we did other communist governments, you imply that somehow that's a defense of Castro. All I'm saying is that I don't...
When you repeat his arguments, Senator, I'm
well,
sorry.
I think we need to hear what his arguments are.
Well, we know what his arguments are, but...
Well, we need to hear that. We need to hear his side of it as well.
Don't you think the Jackson-Vanik agreement helped to bring down the Soviet Union because it denied the Soviet Union access to our market?
All I can tell you is that all the while I've been in public life, we've had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union.
And we have diplomatic relations with Cuba.
Well, we have a kind of a half-baked
we have an
we need to go ahead and get some more...
Officially, we don't really recognize.
We have diplomatic relations with Cuba.
Excuse me, we need to get some more calls in. Danville, Illinois, you're next.
Again, if you need help, come up.
Oh, we lost that call. I think they gave up. Cary, North Carolina, is that right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. McGovern, Mr. Reich.
Yes.
I want to know why the headway and the gains that Fidel Castro has made in Cuba in health care and education and infant mortality are never discussed. And also going back to what was just discussed, why is it the awful oppression of Batista never discussed concerning this? Fidel Castro was forced into taking over that country.
Okay, let's go to the first point. You talked about the gains in Cuba.
There's no question about that. I think that with all of his faults, Fidel Castro has presided over a system that's produced a pretty good educational program in Cuba. it's considerably better than one would find in most of the other countries in Latin America. I think on the health front, the rural clinics that have been set up have performed a great service. They've got a pretty good record on both health and education. I don't see the kind of genocide that Mr. Reich mentioned.
I'm sorry, I never used the word genocide.
Well, you said that he was worse than the Somalian warlords who did practice genocide. They tried to starve their own people.
And Castro starving his people.
Well, he's not doing it deliberately. He put in effect...
All he has to do is change his economic policies.
Why don't we give him a chance? Why don't we...
He's had 35 years of chances.
We've had 35 years, too.
No, but it's his country.
The point is that we expect him to make all the concessions before we make any move on our part. And this is where I think it breaks down. I think that we need to get into discussions with this man at a very high level. I honestly wish that President Bill Clinton would do with Cuba what Richard Nixon did with China. Go there and talk to him, or invite him to come to a third country. I think these two men could sit down and work out a deal that would be in the best interest.
Can I address the health and education thing, because this is... Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. We got to get to some more calls.
Okay. But this is, once again, you have to look at the history of Cuba. The image that you were portraying earlier about Batista. Batista was just, just sort of a run-of-the-mill, corrupt, brutal Latin American dictator. And he has no defenders as far as I know. You have a separate subject, which is Cuban socio-economic development, in spite of Batista and in spite of the other presidents, many of which were corrupt. The fact is that the Cuba that Castro took over in 1959 led this hemisphere in every socio-economic development indicator in either number 1, 2, or 3 positions, in doctors per capita, hospital beds per capita, literacy rates, all these things which, of course, a totalitarian government such as Castro is trying to disguise. Some of your colleagues, members of Congress, went down in the 1970s and came back saying Castro has increased literacy from 25% to 90-some%. I sent them a copy of the 1953 census of population in Cuba that showed 77% literacy. Senator, this is a totalitarian dictatorship that is trying to justify its brutality by saying we are making progress in health and education. Even Hitler built the autobahns and Mussolini made the trains run on time. That does not justify a totalitarian dictatorship.
Portland, Oregon. Let's get some more calls in.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I lived in New Orleans in the late 50s. I came out here in 60, and of course the refugees from Cuba I knew were refugees from Batista, and I'm glad someone finally brought the subject up. How can you make a democratic country out of a country that has not known this democracy, because it certainly wasn't known under Batista? I was acquainted with people whose Batista's guns would go out and threaten to rape the women folks in return for payment.
Senator, you want to respond to that?
She's absolutely right on this. The Cubans have not known democracy for much of their history, certainly not since 1934, when Batista came into power and ruled for 25 years, I regret to say.
I'm sorry, it was 7 years.
No, he ruled from 1934 until 1959.
He ruled from, I'm sorry, that's wrong, Senator. He took over in a revolution in 1933, and he was there for 1 year. He left power.
That's San Martin you're talking about, who ruled for 1 year, 1933, and in 34.
You're talking about Machado, who was overthrown in 1933. Batista was elected president in 1940. He ruled until 1944. He left power. His party lost the election. He left power. He carried out a coup d'etat in 1952, and he ruled until 1959. The other years, Cuba did have freely elected governments.
Let me make this point. Mr. Reich has repeatedly cited the UN findings on Cuba, and obviously they find human rights violations, just as you do, and they find them in China, they find them in the former Soviet Union and in other countries. No one denies that. But what the UN has also done is to pass a resolution with almost unanimous support condemning the American embargo on Cuba and calling on us to lift that embargo. 166 other countries in the world recognize Cuba and trade with them and deal with them.
And it hasn't done any good, has it?
Well, the point is that it leaves us as the one loner trying to block world opinion.
I'm proud to be isolated.
Well,
if it means not giving Fidel Castro money with which to beat up prisoners.
We are down to 10 more minutes. We want to continue with the viewer calls. New York City, go ahead, please.
Yes, this is for Mr. Reich. Mr. Reich, unfortunately, you're dealing with an administration that is totally Marxist supporting. They don't give a damn about human rights violations. They have opened up the gates with Vietnam, with China. Cuba is no different. They really don't care. Why do you think they're supporting Aristide? Aristide is a professed Marxist. They're putting him back in power. They don't care about his his human rights record there. What is going to go on in Haiti is the installation of another Marxist.
Okay, Mr. Wright, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'd like to keep this on Cuba. In the case of Cuba, I have to say that I don't agree with the caller. I think that the administration so far has not listened to the left wing of the Democratic Party, some of whom would like to have the embargo lifted and to have normalized relations with Cuba without conditions, by the way. And I would hope that you would not be willing to lift the embargo without conditions.
No, that's the purpose of the negotiations.
But Senator, Castro knows exactly what he has to do. As I said before, a number of presidents have said, what about free elections? I mean, what about releasing political prisoners?
I don't think you're going to see free elections for a long time in Cuba.
Well, why not?
I don't think you do either, because he doesn't believe in it.
If Castro were gone tomorrow, you could start a process for free elections. I don't know how long it would take. I'm not a Cuban citizen. I wouldn't vote in those elections.
No, you talk about getting rid of Castro as though it's just kind of a gesture on the part of the Cuban people. It would be a bloody horror to try to overturn that regime.
Well, how do you know?
Are we willing to participate? Well, because I know he controls the army, and you know that too.
But that's the point. So in other words, you're saying that it is up to Castro to prevent a bloody horror, as you said it. And I agree with you there. The only person who can prevent a bloody outcome, because the revolution is finished, Senator. It has been finished.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is finished.
The only person who can prevent that is Castro himself. Yeah. That's what you should be talking to him about.
Let's get another call. Hatillo, Puerto Rico. Go ahead, please.
Yes, there's a large communist political party in Cuba. Fidel is not alone. This wet dream that when Castro perished, Cuba will welcome these Cuban exiles with open arms is a fallacy. But let me ask a question. Why the U.S. should continue to feel guilty for the Bay of Pigs fiasco? I mean, the Cubans in exile, if they want Cuba back, go back and take it yourself.
Okay.
Well, I think there's a certain point to that. I don't know anybody, frankly, that's advocating another Bay of Pigs invasion, either on the part of the Cuban exiles or the United States. I want to respond to something that I don't like to hear. I don't like to hear people who are critical of our policy described as left-wingers. I don't think I'm a left-winger. I think that I'm a moderate American and a patriot who's interested in the well-being of this country. And I just said here a moment ago, Richard Nixon has precisely the same view on Cuba that I do. I don't believe anybody's ever called Richard Nixon a left-winger.
Well, I was responding to the lady who called, who said that the Clinton administration was Marxist.
Yeah, which is ridiculous.
Did say, well, that's right. I said that I disagree with the caller. But the left wing of the Democratic Party, Senator, has supported for a long time the lifting of the embargo.
It isn't simply what you call the left wing. There are a good many people in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party that favor precisely the course I've recommended here. Recently, an article appeared in the Washington Post signed by the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Congressman Lee Hamilton. Nobody's ever called him a left-winger. Senator Claiborne Pell, who's been in the Senate now for decades. No one's ever called Claiborne Pell a left-winger.
Well, I'm sorry, but I've heard both of them referred to as quite liberal by a number of people when I was inside the government.
Yeah, let's see, I get another call. Los Angeles. Go ahead, please.
Mr. McGovern, I am really wary of you guys who, as soon as the policy starts pinching the people who we are trying to either control or depose or in some way influence, get themselves into trouble. All of you apologists for Cuba and others crawl out and start this rhetoric about let's give this poor, wonderful, warm man a chance.
Okay. I haven't heard anybody say that. I haven't heard anybody call him a poor, wonderful man. I think he's a very tough, authoritarian dictator. I don't want to live under that kind of system. And one of the reasons I favor a change in American policy is that I think there's a better way to move him away from some of the rigid, hard line that he has pursued all these years. By the way, my position on Cuba is not something that came out in the last couple of months here after the reports about Castro being in trouble. I've had this position since I came to the Senate in 1963, 31 years ago.
Senator, this fax compares Cuba with Haiti. President Clinton lists 4 reasons for intervention in Haiti: to stop human rights abuses, to prevent another exodus of refugees, to help democracy take root throughout the hemisphere, and to show that the U.S. will keep its promises. This person asks, if these are the reasons for invading Haiti, why then are there no plans for launching an invasion on Cuba?
Well, I'm not sure what we're going to hear tonight from President Clinton as to what his policy is going to be and how he's going to justify whatever that policy is. But let me say the conditions are quite different. You have in Haiti an elected president who was deposed by a military coup. We don't have anything like that in Cuba. You have a dictator who's been in power there since 1959, who came there because of the unpopularity of the previous regime. But I don't know anybody in the administration that's suggesting we ought to invade Cuba. I think that's a non-argument.
Let's get another call. Miami, Florida. You're next. Hi, you there?
Hello?
Hi, Miami?
No, this is North Carolina.
Oh, well, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I can tell you how to take care of Cuba real easy. Just gather up a bunch of guns, put a few beans and rice with the guns, put it care packages, go over there and drop them on the ground in Cuba. When them people have guns, Castro can't control them. They will be free people.
Okay, thanks for your question. Let's move on to Kailua, Hawaii.
Yes, I just had a quick question for Senator McGovern. I just was wondering if you discussed your views with members of the Cuban-American community regarding lifting of the embargo and what their response was to your plan as opposed to Otto Reich's.
It's been a while since I've talked with them, but over the years I've had visits with them repeatedly. They know what my position is. I know what theirs are. We respectfully disagree. The leaders of the Cuban-American community would like an even tougher policy towards Castro. They've had legitimate grievances against him. I don't deny that. But the United States is filled with migrants from other countries, from repressive regimes that have come here for over 100 years now. They're welcome, but we can't permit these groups to dominate American foreign policy. I think there's been too much power concentrated in the hands of a handful of people in Miami, and not enough examination of the Cuban issue in terms of what's good for America as a whole.
This is one of the fallacies, by the way. And I want to say one thing, by the way. I hope you don't think that I was questioning your patriotism. I mean, I know your war record and your public service record. That's not what I'm saying. I do think you're wrong. I think you're honestly wrong, sincerely wrong.
That's
I just
one
think
thing we agree on.
That's right.
Each one thinks the other is wrong.
But one of the things that is fallacious is that the Cuban-American community, which only in the last 10 or 15 years registered to vote in sufficient numbers to even elect representatives to Congress, has been the one dictating American policy for 35 years. The reason why American policy has been consistent through liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, is because they all agree when they try to talk to Castro, he doesn't negotiate in good faith, Senator. The story just came out recently that Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State under President Ford, tried repeatedly to begin negotiations with Castro. Castro responded by sending additional troops to Angola and Ethiopia and continuing the subversion of countries in that continent as well as in Latin America.
I'm told we're down to 30 seconds. I'll let you discuss this after the show a little bit. We have to say goodnight because we have to prepare the schedule for President Clinton's Oval Office address a little bit later. George McGovern, the former senator from South Dakota, 1992 Democratic presidential nominee, now president of the Middle East Peace Council. Thanks a lot for joining us. Otto Reich, partner and director with the Brock Group, also leads the US-Cuba Business Council. Thank you for joining us as well. And thank you for your questions and comments. Have a very good night.
Saturday and Sunday, September 17th and 18th, see the 3rd and 4th Lincoln-Douglas debate reenactments live from Jonesboro and Charleston, Illinois. This summer and